Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is a really deep dive into Alberto Daniel Hill's track Denial and Desire. It's widely seen as this unique piece of digital confessional art, and it maps out this very personal, pretty tumultuous journey of psychological reconciliation after digital transgression and the trauma that followed.
Yeah, and what's really striking, I think, is the song's actual structure. It's not just telling a story, it feels like a kind of formalized sonic mechanism. You've got these hybridized elements, the sort of cold synthetic pulse of Italo disco, right up against the deep organic sound of the violoncello. And it's all held together at this deliberate 90 BPM tempo.
Exactly. And the material, it really forces us to look past just the words, the lyrics, and examine the actual architecture of the song. So the central question for us today, it really borrows from the technical language Hill himself uses when he talks about his process. Does this complex, almost rigorous musical structure function mainly as a successful proof of work? Something that validates the protagonist's emotional reconstruction, his transformation? Or does it function more as an irreconcilable protocol of paradox, something that structurally embeds, maybe even permanently memorializes, that core conflict between denial and desire?
Mm. For me, that second interpretation just feels much more compelling. When I listen, the music sounds like, well, a blueprint of ambivalence, really.
See, I take the opposite view. I'd argue the song is an ultimate, maybe even hopeful proof of work. The sheer complexity of it, the very deliberate technical choices, and frankly, the intense artistic labor that must have gone into formalizing this psychological crisis for me, that confirms a successful, verifiable transformation. It demonstrates a resolution to that crisis of identity that followed his severe personal failure. The effort itself is the validation.
And I'm going to argue that while, yes, the effort is undeniable, the result is the structural persistence of conflict. I think the track fundamentally operates as a protocol of paradox. It's a sophisticated sonic diagram, sure, but one reflecting permanent ambivalence. The inherent structural tension, between these conflicting genres and the tempo, it actually prevents it from achieving a true finalized synthesis or resolution. The conflict isn't overcome, it feels like it's enshrined in the music.
Okay, so my position that this track is a proof of work. It's based on this idea that the creation itself, the act of making the song, is the necessary artistic transaction. It's what's required to authenticate the emotional recovery. Hill wasn't just, writing a song, he was engineering a kind of bypass. He talks about his creative process as engaging in narrative archaeology, right? And executing a side channel attack on his own memory. Now, for those maybe familiar with tech terms, a side channel attack, it's about getting data not through the front door, the protected way, but through some kind of peripheral leak, like timing or power use.
So basically bypassing conscious repression.
Exactly. He's choosing not to attack the main defense, what he calls the firewalls of trauma and time. Directly, that would probably just crash the system, right? Cause paralysis. Instead, he finds this peripheral route, the music itself, to extract a raw, honest, emotional data point. The whole process feels deliberate, technical, and profoundly honest. So the resulting track, it works like a post-hacker manifesto. It redirects all that immense intellectual energy that used to go into chasing volatile external desires, the exact drive that led to his downfall, his loss of freedom, which is a classic Stoic warning, right, about chasing external things, redirecting that energy towards internal creative labor. The proof of his change is right there in the complexity and the rigor of the work.
I see why you emphasize the technical labor. I do. But I think the complexity defines identity as something lived perpetually in the gap, the gap between the protective lie, the denial, and the authentic truth, the desire. If you really look at the track's structural complexity, it defines the protagonist not as someone who achieved synthesis, but as someone who's constantly oscillating between these poles. That eclectic mix of genres, electronic, Italo disco, deep house, cello, rock, it's not a successful blend to my ears. It feels more like an impossible amalgamation of contradictory feelings. The musical syntax seems specifically engineered to contain the conflict. Yeah, but ultimately, it fails to actually hide it. It's still right there.
But why does it have to be a failure to hide? Couldn't the containment itself be the success story?
Because the song's thematic conclusion, it seems to acknowledge the indelible mark left by crossing the fine line between white and black. That suggests the transformation is inherently incomplete. The struggle feels lifelong, perpetually active, always paradoxical. The song is a beautiful container for that conflict, I'll grant you, but it doesn't signal the conflict's end.
Okay, that brings us perfectly to the core disagreement then. The psychological meaning of that hybrid genre fusion. I mean, I acknowledge the tension, absolutely. But you seem to view the components as eternally antagonistic, whereas I hear them achieving a kind of necessary, even if maybe unstable equilibrium.
I'd argue the antagonism is fundamental. Those two core sonic pillars, the calculated, almost mechanical repetition of the Italo disco and the deeply organic, almost weeping sound of the cello, they feel like they're in a profound state of warfare. The Italo disco represents that calculated control, the psychological denial trying to impose this perfect, cold facade of systematic function. And the cello, conversely, represents the organic lament, the deep melancholy of internal suffering that the control is trying so hard to suppress. That structural battle is the point. The pervasive melancholy underpinning the energetic beat, as it's described, ensures that the denial is always tethered to a gloomy, inescapable truth. That just solidifies the paradox. You can't have the mechanistic control without the cost, the raw human emotion, constantly threatening to break through.
That's a compelling argument for the presence of the conflict, yes. But I'd frame the function of that conflict differently. If Hill was really invested in denial succeeding, wouldn't the track just be pure, cold Italo disco? A clean system, a perfect facade of mechanical function. The deliberate inclusion of the violoncello, and those moments where the guitar virtuoso, the rock elements, kind of burst in, that feels like the necessary break in the calculated control. That intrusion, the moment the organic sound sort of hijacks the grid. That's the signal of the protagonist's honest confrontation with the unavoidable eruption of desire, of trauma. The pure human cost is right there.
But the hijacking is only momentary, isn't it? The grid, the beat, it always returns.
And the fact that the grid can return but is now sort of irrevocably marked by that organic intrusion, that demonstrates transparency, I think. He used these raw, honest elements to deliberately disrupt his own imposed order. This act of self-disruption, transforming the shame into something audible, into vulnerability, that's the core achievement of the artistic proof of work. He proved his vulnerability by willingly exposing the internal breach, rather than just trying to patch it over with more synthetic control.
I still struggle with that interpretation because the tension just never seems to fully dissipate. The complexity feels like the system running under a really high load, not stabilized after a fix. Let's maybe shift to the tempo, the 90 BPM. I think that actually reinforces the paradox rather than suggesting resolution or some kind of controlled progress. You know, typical high-energy dance genres, they sit closer to 115, maybe 128 BPM speeds that usually signal euphoria, escapism.
Which could be a deliberate choice, right? To avoid the very euphoria that previously led to his transgression.
Yes, possibly. But by setting the tempo at 90 BPM, he establishes what feels like the rhythm of inevitability. It's measured, sure, but it avoids that pure reckless abandon while also preventing pure ecstatic escapism. The tempo stops the denial from being complete because it's too honest, too slow maybe, but at the same time, it compels the protagonist towards this unstoppable reckoning because the beat, however slow, is still relentlessly driving forward. It defines the rate of conflict processing, a controlled confrontation perhaps, but it doesn't confirm the conflict's actual end. It feels like perpetual motion within the conflict itself.
I'm just not convinced that a controlled rate of processing automatically means an unending paradox. Think about the past transgressions that led to his loss of freedom. They were marked by recklessness, by haste, speed, this hunger for volatile external validation. The 90 BPM choice feels like crucial evidence for the proof of work, validating a successful psychological recalibration. It shows purposeful, measured self-regulation. This tempo avoids the deep emotional paralysis that trauma can often bring on, and instead signifies a controlled, purposeful process of reconstruction. This speed represents progress, yeah, but progress under self-imposed control. It suggests a mastery over that impulse towards immediate, potentially destructive gratification. He's moving forward, but soberly.
Sobriety and control, yes. But isn't that tightrope walk inherently unstable? Defined by the constant threat of falling off, that's the paradox. If he went faster, he risks the old recklessness. If he stopped completely, he faces paralysis. 90 BPM feels like the speed of constant vigilance.
But the vigilance is what validates the transformation. It demonstrates that the subject has actually internalized the danger and is actively managing it. The labor of that vigilance is the ongoing proof of work.
But is it proof of resolution or proof of maintenance? I'd argue it's the latter. Let's pivot to maybe the most telling piece of textual evidence, the lyrical confrontation with past actions. I think this really illuminates the internal battle this structure contains. I'm talking about the line, "Guess I'm the fool with my arms out like an angel through the car sunroof."
It's a powerful image, no doubt.
Extremely potent. This image, it's widely interpreted as representing foolish carelessness, right? Reckless exposure. It depicts this state of euphoric desire where the protagonist is completely passive, just contained within a vehicle being driven by destiny, or maybe just the forces of his own unchecked desire. He's not driving, he's just surrendered to the momentum. This self-destructive desire for omnipotence, that craving for a godlike invulnerability, which inevitably leads to the fall, the consequences. That confirms the core conflict for me. The song can only really memorialize the psychological truth that he remains fundamentally unable to control that self-destructive desire. He can only contain it, structurally.
Okay, but I come at that lyrical image from a fundamentally different angle. That powerful, self-critical image, acknowledging himself as the fool, passive, reckless, that is in fact the strongest textual evidence of the proof of work actively happening right there. Think about it psychoanalytically. Denial often leads to this imaginative distortion of the past, doesn't it? Where the subject tries to rewrite their history to avoid the shame. Writing this line, acknowledging the foolishness, and acknowledging the emotional cost, I cry, it's not fair, that represents the conscious, almost technical intervention needed to defalsify his personal history.
It is defalsification. I absolutely agree. But does simply acknowledging a weakness remove it?
It neutralizes its ability to hide and corrupt the system from within. The act of public self-revelation, the transparency about the wound, that's the therapeutic breakthrough needed for transformation. He transformed the shame of the destructive act into the actual fuel for his artistic labor. The proof of work here is the disclosure of the vulnerability, the realization that the past behavior was, while foolish. That acknowledgement is the moment of system integrity verification. He knows the exploit now, and he's publicly documenting it.
But the lyrical content still feels like a map of the truth, not the truth of a fully healed system. The psychological landscape seems defined by that constant gravitational pull between desire and denial. Look at the genre syntax again. The Italo disco, that cool mechanical attempt at distance, it's necessary precisely because the cello, the raw emotion, is so overwhelming. That, for me, is the definition of the protocol of paradox. The structure is engineered specifically to hold the conflict, ensuring its persistence is beautifully rendered, yes, but never fully transcended.
I have to challenge the premise that transcendence is the only valid metric for resolution, though. The transformation, the proof of work, is that he has managed to turn a history of failure, of exploitation, into this complex, intricate, and verifiable soundscape of honesty. He used the very rules of the system he once exploited, that cryptographic concept of proof of labor, to validate his current emotional integrity. He transformed chaos into controlled vulnerability. For me, that is resolution.
And I still maintain the song is an exquisite technical and emotional mirror. It perfectly reflects the author's current psychological landscape, which seems defined by an enduring duality. The structural tension between the mechanical beat of the Italo disco representing the necessity of control and the raw laments of the cello, the unavoidable emotional truth ensures the song remains this sophisticated, complex articulation of an unresolved identity crisis. The conflict is the constant state, the protocol that has to keep running.
Ultimately, I suppose whether one hears a final resolution validated by intense labor or the enduring truth of conflict memorialized in structure, denial and desire really leverages the technical lexicon of cybersecurity proof of work, side-channel attack, firewalls to illuminate this profound, ongoing human struggle for authenticity and recovery.
And maybe that technical language just confirms the rigor, the immense effort required simply to maintain psychological integrity day to day. It shows that the search for authenticity, for freedom from self-deception, it requires an effort that has to be continually verified. A constant measured protocol, just running in the background, knowing the battle, however quiet the beat gets, might never be truly over.